Welcome to Books on Point. Spoilt Ballots reveals the dirt on pivotal events in our history, but it also sheds light on a dozen lesser-known contests, starting with the assassination of King Shaka in 1828 and the ending off with the anointing of President Cyril Ramaphosa at Nazareth in 2017. For more, I'm joined by the authors Matthew Blackman and Nick Dahl. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. We've had you on the show before because last year you published your book, Rogues Gallery, An Irreverent History of Corruption in South Africa. Let's talk about what inspired this particular book. Nick, let's start with you.
Thanks for having us, Nastasia. While we were writing and researching Rogues Gallery, we came across a number of instances of sort of electoral skullduggery, and it dawned upon us that elections might be a fertile and interesting ground to research. Once we started writing the book, it morphed into more than just sort of electoral shenanigans, and it was more about the history of democracy in our country, which, as we found out, is a lot more complicated and sort of goes back 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of history. And it ended up, in many ways, being a history of democracy in South Africa.
Matthew, to those who have read Rogues Gallery and who'll probably get their hands on this particular book, I suppose the relationship that you and Nick have, a brief history on that. What makes this partnership work, especially when it comes to co-authoring a book that has so much history, especially from a South African perspective?
Yeah, both of us are very invested in South African history, and it's telling, and the fact that it's been told for so long in such a strange way and was affected by apartheid-era manipulation of history. So, Nick and I are quite passionate about, exposing a truer history of South Africa, and we just work very well as a partnership. We both have our strengths and our weaknesses, and they kind of work quite well to produce strengths, rather than weaknesses. So we're just very, I guess, passionate South Africans about getting across our history, which is quite often forgotten.
There's a lot of characters here, from King Shaka to Sissy Gould to Hendrik Verwoerd, and I'm wondering, from the research that both of you have done, is there a character that comes to mind in terms of, their legacy and their history that either surprised you on the upside or downside? Nick, let's start with you.
I think the one, to me, that might be the most interesting is Alan Bussak, because I was of an age that, I was sort of becoming politically conscious when Alan Bussak was a bit of a pariah. He'd had a very public affair. He was then found guilty of corruption, and he seemed like a bit of a joke. But in writing this book, I realized that he was one of the key players in bringing apartheid to an end, and he was a truly inspirational leader of the UDF, who gave a speech at Mitchell's Plain in 1985 or 6, I can't remember, that has to go down as one of the most riveting and brilliant speeches in South African history, in fact, perhaps in the history of the world.
Matthew?
Yeah, I think for me there are really 2 people. There's a person called John Fairbairn back in the Cape Colony who really set off non-racial democratic beliefs in the country, or certainly in the Cape Colony, and fought very hard for the first democracy, first democratic elections, which were non-racial elections, surprisingly. So that, for me, and the fact that so little has been written about him, it was incredibly interesting to learn about his life and just what a remarkable human being he was. I guess another person who is really, forgotten in South African history and is barely mentioned a lot, is a guy called Walter Rubusana, who was really, one of the founders of the ANC. He is kind of been supplanted by various other figures, but he was also, what is incredibly interesting about him is that he was the first black politician to be elected into office. He was elected into the Cape Provincial Council in 1910, which is a really extraordinary story. And the fact that he wasn't voted in the next election is also a really interesting story, because a man called Tengo Jabavu decided to run against him, and that's split the vote. And a white politician won the seat in Thembuland. So it was, for me, Walter Rubusana and John Fairbairn are two people who are under-researched and are both incredibly interesting people in our history.
Matthew, I'm going to stay with you for this one. I mean, having read Rogues Gallery and currently read Spoilt Ballots, I mean, there's an aspect here in terms of the importance of history and how South Africans engage with it. What do you, I suppose, as the co-authors of this particular book, what do you take away here in terms of South Africa's relationship with the past? Because the thing about social media and various voices that come to the fore is that, history can almost be rewritten, where we forget some of those characters, as you mentioned there. How do we get to a point where we understand the importance of our history and let our younger generation hear more about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is incredibly important, particularly at the current moment, to, at least recognize our history and understand that the problems that we are facing today are not simply, they didn't simply just happen in the last 10, 15 years. They have, long and deep traditions within the country. One can't begin to solve these issues unless one looks at the origins of them. As a writer called William Faulkner once said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. We have to begin to understand, our current times through a lens of looking at our history, because the two are absolutely fundamentally connected. Until we begin to do this and stop with this very South African attitude of saying, but leave it in the past, why are you bringing up the past? The past is an important source of the present. So, and I think this is what Nick and I are trying to achieve, is to say, look at how similar the past looks to our present. What can we take from this? How can we then understand one another in this country? By looking at what has happened in the past, because we've had a huge amount of trauma in this country, and trauma is something that lives on in people and societies and communities. So we need to understand this.